But first up, let's get into the Great Awokening, why everything is going woke, why it's happening, what it is exactly, and what we should think about it. Now, woke is the word of the moment. You hear it very often. It's something of an idiom, but it does actually have a specific meaning. And I'm going to give a quick primer here on what it means, but then I want to see what's wrong with this whole woke movement. To be woke means to be awake. It means to be awake specifically to the true nature of the Western culture in which you are living. Namely, that this is not truly a society of freedom, of wealth, of opportunity, of progress, that it's not based in basically good principles, that it's not made people comfortable and prosperous, and it is not the best place to live in all of history. No, no, no. To think like that is to be asleep. To be grateful and content is to be foolish. You have not been made awake to the truth. You are not woke. When a person becomes woke when they realize something, that the truth is that this is a culture constructed by white, able, cisgendered, heterosexual, capitalist men, and they made it to serve their own self-interests. The system is therefore oppressive, especially to other groups, as the woke people define groups. So they choose people of color, women, LGBTQ people, and so forth, class divides as well. All these layers, and the more of these layers or intersections, as they call them, that you have, the more oppressed you are. So the person who truly is woke is the person who understands that justice demands the overthrow of this culture to free various identity groups from unjust oppression. Now, what we're seeing commonly, of course, is people who don't necessarily see all of that, but they are people who are becoming woke, people who are starting to wake up to some of these realities and take steps to end the oppression, take steps to end the harm and the injustice. And you'll see things like Mr. Potato Head no longer being a Mr., like children's books promoting heteronormative families being changed, like schools allowing kids to use bathrooms of their choice, laws suppressing religious views on sexuality, excuses made for race riots, they're just raging against oppression, Gina Carano kicked out of The Mandalorian, Israel Folau banned from football, and so on. All of these acts are done in order to challenge the so-called systems of oppression. And notice they occur in relation to those specific attributes, which have been chosen as the tribal sort of identity groups by the woke ideology. So they come along those specific attributes of race, class, gender, sex, sexuality, and so on. Now, that's the way we encounter it all the time, and it's everywhere. I can keep you all day with examples. But the question is, what is it that lies behind this business of being woke, or this awokening? I love that term. I heard it first from Rod Dreher, and also part of my preparation for this was with a talk by Dr. Stephen Shavura. For those of you who know him, I'm going to share that talk in the next few weeks, and you should watch it. It's extremely good. But I want to go into the ideology that is behind this awokening, and it is critical theory. Now, critical theory gives you the tools that you need to help you to see this problem. It actually furnishes people with an entire vocabulary like identity and marginalized and hegemony and colonialism and intersectionality and equity and all this kind of stuff, so that you too can start to use this vocabulary, use this toolkit to see how bad and oppressive society really is. But here are some tenets of the various critical theories that are out there, and there's more than one. Critical race theory is obvious, and there's others as well, but I want to sort of try and pool them in a loose group, and here's one. Oppression is ordinary, it is not extraordinary. It is ordinary. So as already stated, society is shot top to bottom. It's vitiated by oppression. And this is why they throw around the word systemic or systematic. You hear of systemic racism. Well, what does that mean? Well, the whole system, the whole of culture, everything is shot through with racism. It's absolutely everywhere. It's true when you see an overt act of racism, okay? When you can say, aha, that's a racist act. But it's even true when you can't. It's true when you cannot perceive it. In fact, I am being racist now. How on earth is that possible? Well, as a white person, you must be a racist. And that's just by virtue of the amount of melanin in your skin, right? If you deny it, it proves beyond doubt that you genuinely are a racist. Because the truth is that every action of yours comes out of your white-centeredness. And if you deny that, what you're really doing is protecting your whiteness and perpetuating oppression. You're trapped in that sin. You can't really escape it. In fact, I recently read Robin DiAngelo's White Fragility, which is one of the big popular books at the moment, which is based on critical race theory. It's probably the biggest, I think. And she makes that point. There's really no way out of here. You can't escape. You know, she as a white person is going to spend the rest of her life trying to find out how not to be racist, and she can only ever slowly approach that goal. There's an article that appeared in Yahoo just yesterday, and it was titled this, "Whiteness is a Pandemic." And here's part of it, just to give you some idea of how far this goes. Whiteness is a public health crisis. It shortens life expectancies, it pollutes air, it constricts equilibrium, it devastates forests, it melts ice caps, it sparks and funds wars, it flattens dialects, it infests consciousness, it kills people. White people and people who are not white will die in 2050 because of white supremacy-induced decisions from 1850. Notice, right, the whole edifice from way back at the beginning. What was it? Well, first it was white. And that's what critical race theory points out. And if it was white then, people are going to die in 2015 because of whiteness. And that's really the source of all these great evils. Now, all the critical theories together focus on more than just race. There's also the patriarchy, and there's also various capitalism, and there's various other things like that. But that's a lot of oppression, right? I mean, we are living under a lot of oppression in the West at the moment. I mean, it's amazing it's not killing us. I mean, we're worse than Saudi Arabia. I mean, that's how crazy it gets, okay? It's quite demented. But that's the first thing, oppression is ordinary. Secondly, words matter, and this is significant. Absolutely everything matters in culture, but words and language are a key one. The US Congress, for example, recently passed new rules about gendered language, not to use mother, father, sister, brother, but parent and sibling and things like that. Or even worse, the Australian National University here in Australia recently said, well, we should say chest feeding, not breastfeeding, and we should say gestational parent, not mother. All this ridiculous stuff. Critical theory, you see, must command language in order to stop the oppression that language is perpetuating on minorities. But also critical theory is very opposed to free speech, because free speech is unpredictable speech, and unpredictable speech permits things to be said which perpetuate oppression and hate and which harm minorities and undermine their well-being. And of course this oppression is absolutely everywhere, even in language. And so under this woke ideology, you will never find that free speech is promoted. You will find hate speech codes. You will find ruthless overreactions to speech, like Israel Folau can never play football again in Australia. Why? Because he said stuff on Instagram. Or you'll see the big tech corporations. What are they doing? Cracking down on speech, enforcing codes all the time. Here's a third tenet. All power is self-interested, they say. So if somebody has any kind of power and privilege, and people do, and not just in the categories that the woke people say, it's far more complex than that, but people have all sorts of privileges and power, but they say you cannot use that position in any other way than a self-interested way. So if you're white and you have that, privilege, then you can only ever establish your whiteness. You can never truly use it in the interest of others. And so really what that probably means is that to truly love one's neighbor, as the Bible commands, is impossible, because your power will always be used in a self-interested way. It's a pretty ugly sort of situation to be in. Fourthly, it's a revolution. It's a politically weaponized ideology. In fact, one might argue that that's all it is. I mean, it needs something to criticize, right, to be a critical theory. What's it criticizing? Well, it's criticizing the edifice which it calls Western civilization. I think it's a bit more specific than that, but let's go with it. So without the Western civilization, it can't exist, right? It is just a theory set up to attack. And that's what it is. And this is why, it drives always towards a revolution. It drives always towards the overthrow of the system, which is shot, run through with oppression. And that's why these movements, which are sort of bounded in wokeism or political or critical theories, usually are very violent, anarchistic, or at least that they're raggedy protest movements. I remember the Extinction Rebellion people in Brisbane gluing themselves to the pedestrian crossings. Or you can go all the way up to the fact that Black Lives Matter sort of had a bit of a reign of terror on a number of cities in the United States for a very, very long time, burning them and looting them and destroying them and so on. And so it's revolutionary. So it's an impulse to overthrow. It becomes violent when it really ramps up. Fifthly, equality is not what you always thought it meant. We always thought that equality meant, so everyone's equal, give them all the same opportunity, and then give them the moral responsibility to use the opportunity well. In a perfect world, if we could achieve that, that's equality. No, listen to Ibram X. Kendi, who wrote one of the other really top-selling volumes, popular volumes based on critical race theory, How to Be an Anti-Racist. Ibram X. Kendi says, if we truly believe that all humans are equal, then disparity of condition can only be the result of systemic discrimination. In other words, no, it's not about being equal at the beginning, it's about being equal at the end. And if you don't have an equal outcome in life, then it's only because of discrimination. That's the only explanatory principle, by the way. It's like when you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And this is all they've got. Oh, inequality, oppression, systemic discrimination. It's all they have. So if, for example, someone is poor, well, it's because of discrimination. Or if, for example, someone doesn't have, and when I say someone, they think in tribes, so groups. But when somebody doesn't have political power, well, it's because of discrimination. If somebody isn't in the boardrooms in corporations, it's because of discrimination. If somebody is, anything, it's because of discrimination. There's no other explanatory principle. And so the idea here is to make everyone the same, which is crazy. And we're going to get to why that's crazy in the next point, which is that this is a utopian set of ideas. So what they say is that, well, okay, all this inequality and this bad stuff, if we look really hard, we can see it around us. We see instances of sexism, and they do. We see instances of racism, and they do. We see instances of, pollution in the air causing climate change, and they do, right? They see all of these things, and they say, yeah, but see, we've got these great ideas that will result in none of those things happening. We can envisage a world where none of this bad stuff goes on. So it's utopian, because they say there's perfection in this life. They say Judgment Day comes in this life when we have the revolution, and then you have heaven on earth when all is perfect. Not so. See, the only way you can get what they want in terms of perfection is to make everyone have the same outcome. The only way you can do that is with totalitarian power. Because if you want to make a man and a woman have the same outcome every time, because they won't by themselves, because they make different choices, and because all sorts of other factors at play, because they are in fact different as a man and a woman, no. If you want to make them the same, you need to control everything. And that's the problem, right? And it is a totalitarian, utopian movement. Now, those are some of the tenets of this view of the world. And here's the thing, right, that always gets me. It's so deceptive. It deceives because it bases itself in realities. LGBTIQ people, for example, do have poor mental health outcomes. That is true. Gender dysphoria is a real condition, and people who have it are very vulnerable and fragile and need care. That is true. African Americans as a whole have a higher rate of violence and crime in their communities in America. That is true. There's a very real concern that women face concerning their own personal security, and it's something that goes with them in their daily life. And why is that? Because there's some guys out there that do the wrong thing. That is true. That is true. Or it is also true to say that the majority of politicians that were knocking around at the founding of a lot of these Western countries were white men. That is true. So it finds these truths, and then, however, it gives them a false explanation, and it weaponizes them for the revolution. They say, well, the only reason any of this is the case is because of oppression. That's the only explanatory principle. And it teaches then victims of this so-called systemic oppression, which is built into the language, into the culture, into the religion, into the systems, into the democracy, into the science, into the everything about the Western culture. It preaches to those victims that the oppressors are oppressing them, and it preaches to the oppressors to make them sorry and repentant, and it mounts an activist attack on the institutions of society. It goes after the police, blaming them for African American violence. It goes after the church, blaming them for LGBTIQ health outcomes. It goes after the law courts, blaming them for women's safety concerns. It goes after capitalism, blaming it for the environmental situation. It goes after families, blaming the Stone Age ideas of parents about gender for the oppression of their gender questioning children, and so on and so on. The anger behind these lies is what becomes the driving force for revolution, targeted against key cultural institutions like families, like the economic system, like the rule of law with this latest Women's March for Justice thing. Really, that's a big target, the legal system, and so on and so on. The truth is police don't cause African American violence. The lie that they kill African Americans in absurdly disproportionate numbers is demonstrably false. Roland Fryer, an African-American researcher at Harvard University, to his own surprise, has pretty much demonstrated this conclusively, but there have been other studies as well. Families don't oppress their children by raising them as boys and girls. The studies continually show that people grow out of gender dysphoria when left through puberty. The church did not cause LGBTQ health outcomes. People with LGBTIQ inclinations, the research shows, when they don't go to church, do not improve in their mental health. And also there's something called the Dutch paradox, identified by researchers, which is that when they live in countries that are more LGBT affirming, it does not have a commensurate impact on their mental health outcomes. That's a fact. The simple reality is that the explanations offered by the woke brigade to try and make people upset and mount the revolution against really important institutions, they're false explanations. They're identifying some truths and they're actually lying about them in order to raise people up. And that anger is caused in the fact that people perceive themselves to be victims, and that anger makes them activists. And we know that these ideas are found everywhere. They're found now in all of the key places that have control over culture: media, big tech and corporates, workplaces, education, activism, entertainment, government. You know, what is the Equality Act if it's not this? What is the Change and Suppression Act if it's not this? To eradicate ideas for the sake of helping so that they improve the wellness and stop harming minorities. But what's the target? Well, it is in fact Christian teaching. That's the target. Or in education, people don't realise that actually primary schools equip young people with the language and the vocabulary needed to understand critical theory so that they can be awakened to the problem in society. Like marginalisation, identity, diversity, relativism, discrimination, environmentalism, racial justice, respectful relationships, safe schools, equity, equality, minority. It's all there. I've looked at the average lesson plan. It's all there, and people get up in arms about safe schools, not realising the whole system is pretty woke, let's put it that way. We know the media, you know, they're taking up the Meghan Markle thing because she said racism and pointed at the royal family. Well, there's a white supremacist institution in the woke ideology. They've got to go after it, they've got to take it out, and racism is the tool, right? And you see the media's all over that far more than the average person. So, you know, I could go on. It is absolutely everywhere. Gina Carano out of The Mandalorian, that's entertainment. We know all about that. We know about higher education. We know about all those things. But see, the power of all these institutions needs to be exerted in order to bring about the woke empire, because totalitarian power is going to be ultimately necessary to make it happen. People need to be controlled because the outcomes for everyone need to be prescribed for equity, for equality of outcome. And we're going to see the power of these institutions is going to be really, really flexed in the name of wellness, in the name of protecting minorities, in the name of looking after people, in the name of preventing harm, right? You're not going to be able to say what you want. You're not going to be able to go and live your life as you want. You're not going to be able to be part of institutions that are meant to be harmful in that respect, like churches. You're not going to, you know, that's kind of the woke utopia. Well, not kind of, it is the woke utopia. Let's be clear about this. And this is very widespread, and it's really come on very strongly in recent years. And now it's just coming like a Gatling gun, just one thing after another every day. We're continually reading about it. You know, it's been amazing to me to watch how the people of goodwill have been very numb to this reality. Even the Prime Minister was interviewed on radio recently, and he was asked whether something was too woke or whether people were too woke. And his response was, "I don't care." And I just think that there's been so many people, you know, of his age and older, not everyone, I'm not having to go at a generation, I don't like doing that, but there's been so many people who have said that, I don't care, it's not a big deal, the young people will grow up and they'll grow out of it. Well, the young people did grow up, and then they went on and they found Silicon Valley companies, they went into Hollywood, they went into politics, they went into the academies, they got journalism degrees, and here we are. Here we are. And there really is just this generational wave that's taking place. But I want to make this point before I close out this topic. I want to give a bit of a chunk here to why does this really matter? Why is this really a problem? And why do we need to understand this clearly and avoid it? Because actually the whole woke thing has a very theological flavour. I mean, it's a little bit like Marxism in the sense that, you know, Marxism said, well, all was well until the fall, which was the advent of capitalism. Well, you know, here we have the advent of colonialism, and that's the fall. And then there's this great class struggle that follows, you know, where people are fighting with each other. But don't worry, the day of judgment is coming when the oppressed will rise up against the oppressor, and there'll be judgment, and then there will be utopia thereafter. It's very, very Marxist in that respect, and that's why people use the phrase cultural Marxism. But here are some aspects of its theology that are dangerously false. The first one is that it's wrong about evil. See, the truth is the problem is not men. The problem is not white people. It's not the rich. It's not the powerful. It's not Trump supporters. It's not heteronormative people. It's not religionists. The problem is evil. Evil knows no boundary of class, of tribe, or identity. Evil afflicts minorities and victims just the same. It afflicts and infects women, people of colour, homosexuals, transgenders, migrants, the poor, the weak. To struggle with evil is to be human. As Alexander Solzhenitsyn said so crucially, after he went through a very similar totalitarian period that got a lot worse than what we're facing now, but it really got bad, it really got a run on. And he said, you know, we didn't realize something. We wouldn't kill evil by attacking these tribal identity groups. We would only kill evil when we realized that the line of evil runs down every human heart. All evil, all people are afflicted by evil. To struggle with evil is to be human, right? And here's the thing, if you say that the person doesn't struggle with it, but that it's everybody else, it's all the isms and the phobias and the other tribes and the oppression, then it stops them from ever undergoing any kind of repentance, which every human being needs to do to ever be right with God. That's why, first of all, this really matters. The second one is that it's wrong about truth, not just wrong about evil, but wrong about truth. See, it's based on this notion that there are truths that are accessed by each group of people by dint of who they are, like the concentration of melanin in my skin. I don't know that I have any actually, but however much melanin you've got in your skin, that's meant to define how you access truth. Or whatever the chromosomes are in your cells, that also defines the truth you have access to. And your standpoint gives you a truth that is completely inaccessible by, say, me, a white man who has a different truth, and I've got no right to speak about it. You know, here, no uterus, no opinion, say, you know, the feminist brigade. You know, you can't access my truth as a woman, you know. Well, why don't we get the perspectives of people of color, this kind of stuff? And I'm, you know, fine. When people have experiences, it's always worth hearing what those experiences are, but it doesn't affect truth. I mean, how could such a thing like melanin concentration, a trivial genetic difference, have such a metaphysical effect on my access to truth? Because this idea is necessary to say, well, white men could not make a good society for all. And that's a lie. Because what is true for all. Evil for me is evil for you. Righteousness for me is righteousness for you. God to me is God to you. Salvation to me is salvation to you. There is one truth. It is good for all. It's not just wrong about sin and wrong about truth, it's wrong about righteousness. Because it says that evil is the problem, but it says that evil is power and it travels in identity groups. Well, that's not true. Evil, righteousness, and then it says righteousness travels in the oppressed, in overthrowing the power. Well, that's not true. Righteousness doesn't travel that way. Righteousness is the answer for every individual, everybody, regardless of tribe. And the oppression and righteousness is revealed from God in the Lord Jesus Christ to any who repent of their evil and invest their faith in Him. And that is the greatest equality in the world, and it is first individual. It is also the solution to all the problems they describe. The African American community, what's the solution? Righteousness. The white male community, not that there are these communities, this is one of the things that this whole woke thing has done to us. It's broken us apart. But let's go with it just for a minute. The white male community, what's the answer? Righteousness. You know, the LGBT community, what's the answer? Righteousness. And it's the same for us all. But see, they never permit moral agency as an explanation for anything. It's only oppression. That's wrong. It's also wrong about creation. And, you know, I think that this is possibly the most, it's got to be up there with about the most significant thing that's wrong with all of this. The revolutionary impulse is directed against certain things that it wants to break apart. And notice what those things are. They're things like, and I've said this before, they're things like man and woman, right? The gender binary, oppressive. They're things like heteronormativity, you know, the fact that men and women are made for each other and sexual relations are designed that way around marriage and all the rest of it. You know, that's got to be broken apart for liberty. And people in this movement like Ros Ward, founder of Safe Schools, will say all that stuff. It's also around, you notice they're always pro-choice and abortion. It's because it's an attack on life and children. It's the family, right? And that's also with the gender dysphoria thing. It's family that they're attacking. It's also patriarchy, the fact that men are actually supposed to take their responsibilities, and they are given key responsibilities by God, and the fact that God is in fact patriarchal. It's a he, right? And the idea that creation is for us, not us for creation. We're supposed to rule over it. We're given it as a resource, all this kind of stuff. You see that its view of creation, its view of God's good things, its view of God's innate design to which we are called, right, as creation ordinances, to which we are called as high standards. No, all of those things are oppression and bad and evil. And it's amazing to me how this impulse of revolution consistently targets itself against God's good things. It's wrong about creation. And here's the other thing. Its fruits are bitter. It was said, and I owe this to the talk I watched by Dr. Stephen Shavura, which I will share and which you should watch. But he makes a point. He says, you know, this phrase, the Great Awokening, which some academics have come up with, he compares it with the Great Awakening, which was the Christian revival in America in the 1730s and 40s. And it was observed about that revival that the key fruits were holiness and joy. You know, the fruits of the Great Awakening, they are sin and strife. That's what they are. It's interesting that the fruits of righteousness are said to be peaceable. It's interesting that the works of the flesh in Galatians 5 and Hebrews 12 are said to be enmity, anger, strife, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy. You know, a surprising number of New Testament scriptures point out the contrast between the peace of righteousness and the strife and envy and jealousy and division and clamoring of evil. And the cultural Marxist dogma worms its way into people's thinking to create internalized resentment and grievance. And that gives birth to these identity-based rivalries and divisions, which gives birth to anger and dissensions, and which give birth to real strife. And it gives a permission structure to jettison self-control and to go for the riot. Notice how angry these movements are. Notice how the language they use, the riots they start, the complete lack of self-control, fighting violence with violence and hate with hate, flouting the law. You know, this is not good. You don't have to be a genius to understand all these details about the whole woke thing. You can simply look at its basic fruits, and you can read what it says in Galatians 5 and see there the answer you're looking for. He says, Paul does, now the works of the flesh are evident: sexual immorality, impurity, sensuality, idolatry, sorcery, enmity, strife, jealousy, fits of anger, rivalries, dissensions, divisions, envy, drunkenness and orgies and things like these. I warn you, as I warned you before, that those who do such things will not inherit the kingdom of God. How many of those? I mean, critical theory is making people angry, divided, envious, jealous, enemies, strife makers, and yes, sensual and impure and sexually immoral. It's actually locking people into that. But Paul says the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against such things there is no law. And all who belong to Christ Jesus have crucified the flesh with its passions and desires. It's very simple, you know. This is not of God. And let me say quickly, I just want to make a point. It's wrong about guilt and forgiveness. There's no room for forgiveness in this theory. There's only the resentment. There's only the anger. There's only the retribution that has to happen for the day of judgment to come and the revolution to take place so that righteousness can come in. And you know, that is a spirit of Antichrist, because if Jesus is anything at all, he is forgiving and forgiveness. And we don't just forgive people because they join the church, like this movement, that you must join the movement. And even then, it's not forgiveness. Jesus said, you know, even those who crucified him, he said, Father, forgive them. They know not what they do. The spirit of forgiveness is crucial, and it is lost in this worldview, and that is dangerous, really dangerous. Not to mention, it's wrong about the future, that there is utopia on earth. I'm afraid there's not. That's in the next life, and we have between now and then to be right with God. And that truly is the issue. So this is why woke culture, which is everywhere, needs to be opposed. It truly is an anti-God set of ideas. So let us be discerning, and let us not allow this to shape our thinking, but instead we should renew our minds with the truth of God. Hey, thank you so much for watching. If you liked what you saw, then make sure to hit the like button. If you want to never miss another video again, make sure to subscribe, or you can right now watch more videos right here. Cheers.